All right, hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We are in Acts chapter 18, and again, as Paul, we were introduced to Aquila and Priscilla, a dynamic husband and wife ministry team. And that's very interesting. Remember, I said as we go through the book of Acts, in an indirect way, the book of Acts also becomes our sort of blueprint, not kind of line by line or word by word, but it certainly gives us, if you study the book of Acts, it gives us a blueprint. It gives us some examples in terms of the New Testament church. So, for example, this is something that I'm doing on another study that I wish I had studied, found this in the book of Acts. Here's a good example of what I mean. Here's a good example of this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, when you're talking about the gifts of the Spirit, and one of the gifts of the Spirit is the discerning of spirits, or as it is also in the translation that I use, the Holman Christian Standard Translation, distinguishing between spirits. And while Paul does not, he just kind of lists the gifts, but not necessarily lists them and then describe them. As we are reading through the book of Acts, we're seeing examples of, for example, speaking in tongues. We see an example of what an apostle and a prophet, a pastor, an evangelist is. We're seeing these different examples in the book of Acts, and the distinguishing the spirits, or it's always, well, what did that mean? And we kind of saw it in when Paul ran across the slave girl who was praising him, saying, "Oh, these men are the great men of God." He was able to detect it was actually she was driven by a spirit. He cast the devil out the girl, and he caused a whole bunch of. That's Acts 16. So that's just again some of the examples. So I say that because the more conservative Christian churches that will say, under no circumstances could a woman pastor. Then I say, look, you got examples, great examples of with Aquila and Priscilla, and I know some very difference of minds, and she's now with the Lord, who were great examples of Aquila and Priscilla. um, I'm going to call their name because some of y'all are going to know their names. But Apostle uh, Tyrone Collins, and then the late Dr. Cheryl Collins. But when you go back, and I've known them for years. I knew known them for years. Back when I was a youngster. But I, if you want to look at how a ministry husband and wife team was, because they kind of ministered together. I know other obviously couples and stuff, but that's a kind of example there, okay, and that they ministered kind of equally together, okay. All right, let's see. Let's go back to it. I'll start in verse 1 since we only got so far. We got a lot of backstory here. But he said, after this, he left Athens and went to Corinth, where he found a Jewish man named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Okay, so this is as far as we got. Now, I'll just move on. Remember, I said too that this is kind of a good example also of how the scholars give us the information. Like if you have a study Bible, and you will see sometimes descriptions, or you will see notes, whatever, and they would say, like for example, this dating here of this event. They can compare this event by historical records that they have found through archaeology. So we know that Claudius did this around AD 51, which we also know that Corinthians, First and Second Corinthians, were written around AD 51. So it kind of gives us a kind of a neat timeline when you go back to the book of Acts, which kind of starts around AD 33. So it kind of gives you a timeline there where we're talking about what, a little over 20 years, right? Or just under 20, 18, 19 years, if I got that right. Anyway, so kind of timeline, we can see this. All right, so it says here, where he found a Jewish man named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul came to them. So now they become very close friends. And one of the reasons why, now look at the verse 3, and being of the same occupation, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. Now, very interesting here that Paul, and it wasn't uncommon for Jewish males to have a trade. And in this case, we can see Paul was a tent maker. That was his trade. Not They didn't always live off of ministry, and especially when you had situations where Claudius kicked all the Jews out. So let's say if they had businesses, let's say in Rome, they just lost all that business. They always had their trade that they can fall back on. So that's kind of interesting to know that, and really there are ministries today. When I say ministries, I'm thinking of a monastery that is in the area where I live at. Okay, in the metropolitan area anyway. That was built by monks. Now it's a park district, but it was built by monks. I mean, this thing was nice size, huge monastery. Okay, and it had the old stone bricks, and it had all of that was done by the monks. All the building, I think most of the building was done by monks. You know, and they had that trade. So when you look at the walls, when you look at the stuff here, I don't know if things like the boiler and stuff was done by the monks. I think the electric was put in, the plumbing was put in. In other words, the monks had those trades. Very interesting. Okay, so so Paul and them back up was they were tent makers, and notice he said they worked. So while Paul was the great apostle Paul, notice he worked. Okay, he worked. Now, I think I mentioned this last time with Corinth. Corinth was a very wealthy city, or middle class to upper middle class city. To the point, and you can read this in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, where Paul did not take an offering from them because they were hung up on money. And they actually got mad that Paul didn't take money. And Paul even told them that I took from other churches. Why? Because y'all hung up on money. But they were very affluent. They had affluence, city of Corinth, very wealthy. But they was also, of course, as we said before, very corrupt, very, license. We call it immoral. Okay, that's the best word. Immoral. Okay. So anyway, they went to Corinth, and then that's where they kind of hooked up there. And then we're going to see that Paul's going to do a great work here in Corinth. Verse 4 says, he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade both the Jews and the Greek. Now, again, this word persuade is the word we also use for faith and belief. In other words, we could easily substitute that. But so he said he tried to persuade them. And sometimes when you see from a personal person, they will say, I believe, I was persuaded. And that's what it means. So one was I have faith, that's the noun, that's faith is noun. Then I believe is the verb, but it means persuaded. And you see here that they're using the word persuade, that this is Paul now, his preaching was trying to persuade them or to bring them into faith. Okay? So he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade both Jews and Greeks, which means that some of the Greeks were coming to the synagogues. Now, remember the Jews were kind of these were Jews that were dispersed, and they were living in and among the Romans. In a lot of cases, they held to their Jewish culture. Verse 5 says, when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia. Now, it's kind of interesting, too, as we go through the book of Acts, that if you put these cities together with Paul's writings, Macedonia would be Philippians, okay? So it says, when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with preaching the message and solemnly testifying to the Jew that Jesus is the Messiah. Now remember, he would always go to the Jews first. People, even though we know Paul as the apostle, okay, as the apostle to the Gentile, he was also the apostle to the Jews, even though the bulk of his work was among the Gentiles, taking the message of grace to the Gentile. But he also preached to the Jews. Verse 6, but when they resisted, and blasphemed, he shook his robe and told them, your blood is on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. And of course, we're going to see this was Paul really sticking it to him. But we'll see that later in a few chapters. Verse 7, so he left there and went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. So he kind of walked out, okay, and went next door, okay. It's kind of funny because I'm going to be comical here. You ever go to like larger cities? You're mostly going to see this in larger cities. So you kind of go to kind of poor neighborhoods in larger cities. You have what they call storefront churches. And literally, excuse me, and storefront churches were, they could be as small as, let's say, 25 feet in width and then maybe 50 feet long. So that's could be a very small storefront church, storefront. And obviously they were initially for businesses. So you can put a cleaners in, you can put whatever business, you can put it in there. Those are the smaller ones. And of course there were larger storefronts. And then when business would move out, some churches would occupy these storefront churches. So you can have, 10, 15, 25 members. And then that was kind of a starting place for the ministry. And but in some places you would see where you could have a missionary Baptist church, a Pentecostal church. I'm trying to think. Usually, I've seen like 3 to 4 churches in a row next to each other, which wasn't that wasn't that common, but that was kind of interesting here. And I'm thinking about this here when he said, so he left the synagogue and then he went to the house that was next door to the synagogue. Now, some of these people, remember, some of these wealthy people oftentimes would open their houses to the Christian. They were wealthy, and sometimes they would have large rooms, okay? And so they would open their homes, and some of these wealthy, they could seat anywhere 50, 100, 150 people, depending on how big the house was. Now, verse 8 says, Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed the Lord along with his whole household. And then it says, many of the Corinthians, when they heard, get this, believed and were baptized. So a lot of Corinthians, right? We would call this today a move of God. Okay. Notice, even the synagogue, the one he just left. Okay, the leader of the synagogue, he just left. Well, he didn't leave, the synagogue leader didn't leave, but he believed on the Lord. Now, verse 9 says, "And the Lord said to Paul in the night vision, don't be afraid, but keep speaking, and don't be silent. But I am with you, and no one will lay a hand on you to hurt you, because I have many people in this city." And he stayed there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. Now, this is interesting here when you look at the dynamic here. How God, now first and foremost, notice Paul often had these kinds of visions, dreams, and revelation for the ministry that God had called him to. And so God tells him, don't be afraid. Now, why is that? We're going to see just in a moment why Jesus is telling them that. But notice they spent 1.5 years teaching the word of God in this city. Oh, it's All right. So, verse 12. While Galileo was proconsul of Archia, okay, the Jews, now Corinthians was in Archia, the city of Corinth, the region. Remember, there were regions. Galatian was a region. Um, um, what's the one I'm just thinking about here? But Archia was one, and it had the city of Corinth. So he says, while Galileo was proconsul of Archia, the Jews made a united attack against Paul and brought him to the judges' bench. Now, we understand why Jesus told him, don't be afraid, right? You're going to be all right. So you see this now attack, this assault. He says, this man, they said, persuades people to worship God contrary to the law. Now, they're making a Jewish case. Now, watch this, because this is going to be very interesting. They're making a Jewish case to the Gentile proconsul. As Paul was about to open his mouth, Galileo said to the Jews, if it were a matter of a crime or a moral evil, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you Jews. Now, you see this attitude that they had. Like I told you, the Jews were not the most favorite people. Even today, you have a lot of people today that hate the Jews. And I would ask people too, why do you hate the Jews so much? Why do you hate them? And I would guarantee you that not one can give an intelligent reason why. Verse 15, but if these are questions about words, names of your own law, see to it yourself. I don't want to be a judge to such things. So he drove them from the judge's bench. Now, in other words, don't bother me with your Jewish laws. Now, the Jewish law, remember what happened when when the Romans took over the Jews. So they were kind of inherited from the previous world kingdoms, such as the Grecian kingdom, Mede and Persian kingdoms, and the Babylonian kingdoms. And again, they would allow them to, like the Romans, say, okay, keep your culture and stuff, just as long if it did, that it didn't conflict with Rome. Of course, they wouldn't. And then, but they didn't. The Jewish law, even though the Jews were allowed to kind of keep it, they had to stay within the Roman law. The Roman law superseded the Jewish law. And we're going to see this here all the time. This is why the Jews could not execute Jesus. They needed to persuade Pilate to give the order because they couldn't. Because if they could, yeah, they would have been killed Jesus, but they couldn't. There were certain things they couldn't do. By Roman law, they were restricted. So, you see this attitude here towards the Jews. And then verse 17 says, then they all seized Sullivan, the leader of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the judge's pen. But none of these things concern Galileo. Now, the one thing about Sullivan here, this name, and we'll come back, but one of these things about this name, Sullivan, is we see him in the book of, in the letter of Corinthians, as the beloved brother. And some ask, and a good question is that, did this beating kind of convince, because they thought they had Rome on their side. And there's a lot of parallels I could make with this, with the politics scheme today, but I won't. But they attempted to use the Jewish law, the Jews attempted to kind of insert the Jewish law in a Roman setting, and Galileo was like, I don't even like you guys. And so they beat Sullivanus, right? They beat Sullivanus, and boom. And Galileo was kind of like, right? All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought, a comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome. I'll see you in the next study.